Hi, this is Chris from OWNorDisown. Today we're going to be taking a look at some handheld PCs across multiple generations and seeing how they hold up against the revered Steam Deck. For our comparison, we have the units you see before you, and this includes the One X Player Mini with the 11th Gen Intel 1195 G7, the Ionea Next with the AMD 5825U, the AOKZOE A1 with the AMD 6800U, and of course the Steam Deck, currently sporting a beautiful forged carbon skin from M2 Skins. We've got a lot of material to cover here, as this is effectively 4 reviews in one video, so let's jump right in with an overview of each unit. Starting things off, we're taking a look at the One X Player Mini. This particular unit was released a couple years ago, and it came in both AMD and Intel flavors. This one has the Core i7 1195 G7, which was the top-of-the-line Intel 11th generation chip. It also has 16 gigs of LPDDR4X running at 4266, a 512 gig drive. It has a 7-inch IPS LCD that rocks 1920 by 1200 in terms of resolution, which is really crisp and fine. However, it is the dimmest of the bunch, and it only has 60 hertz, so for a refresh rate. The Wi-Fi chip goes up to Wi-Fi 6. There's no 6E here. It is the smallest of the units we're going to be taking a look at today at 10.25 by 4 by about 1. It weighs 1.3 pounds. It has 2 USB-Cs, which are fully functional. That includes DisplayPort, power delivery and data, and 1 USB-A 3.0. So let's go ahead and pick this up and take a look. So already I can see that there's a couple of option keys over here on the right that don't appear to do anything, at least while we're in game. Right now we're running Elden Ring. Taking a look around, there is a key on the left that goes back to the desktop. Along the top, you've got your volume rocker, your power button, your 3.5mm headphone jack, and a couple of USB ports. Around the back is a really neat hexagonal fan-shaped design. I actually kind of like this design quite a bit. And on the bottom, you have USB-C and what appears to be some sort of proprietary docking port. Alright, so as you can see, we're going to run around in Elden Ring here. Yeah, it performs okay. So what you'll find with the Intel chip is there's some quirkiness with the graphics driver. Some of these tests we couldn't actually complete. We've got quite a few games that we tested, but Elden Ring seems to be running fine. I'm going to go ahead and put this down now, and we'll move on to the next one. Alright, I've gone ahead and swapped out the One X Player for the Ionea Next. This was an interesting device. This one was the first one that came with the 5825U, which was a slightly upgraded chip over the 5800. A full Ryzen system. It's got 16 gigabytes of LPDDR4X at 4266, much like the One X Player. Same size drive, same size IPS LCD, although this one's a lower resolution. It's 1280 by 800. Still only 60 hertz. This unit does come with Wi-Fi 6E, which is a nice boost. And it's about the same size, but slightly taller and thicker than the One X Player, and also slightly heavier. This one does not have the USB-A, but it does have 2 full-featured USB-C ports on the top and the bottom, and a 47 watt-hour battery. And of course, another headphone jack. All of these units will have headphone jacks, which is nice to see. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at this unit here. Alright, so picking this thing up here, you'll immediately notice there's some interesting button placement. Over on the left-hand side, there's where the start and select buttons are. And then there's a couple of buttons on the right. The big one opens up this little overlay that comes with the unit. They have been updating this, so it is a little bit more polished than maybe some of the other units that you'll see, though not quite as polished as Steam Deck. So let's run around Skyrim a little bit here. So if we take a look up at the top, there's a power button / fingerprint reader, a couple of volume buttons, 3.5mm headphone jack, and your USB-C. Around the back, it's pretty plain Jane. There's one circular cutout for the fan, but a nice smooth matte black finish. And on the bottom, you've got your speakers, bottom firing speakers, and another USB-C port. So you'll find that the AMD drivers tend to run a little bit better and smoother. And there's definitely not as many compatibility issues as you'll find with the Intel drivers once we get to the gaming benchmark section. So that pretty much sums it up here. I'm going to go ahead and grab the AOKZOE A1. Wow, that's a mouthful. And we'll take a look at that unit. Alright, the AOKZOE A1. Man, that's a mouthful. This is the biggest, beefiest of the units we're going to take a look at today. It's got the Ryzen 7 6800U, 16 gigs of LPDDR5 running at 6400 megahertz, same size drive, an 8-inch LCD running at 1920 by 1200, but still only 60 hertz, Wi-Fi 6E, It's a bit of a chonker, 11.2 by 5 by 1.4. It weighs 1.6 pounds. It's got those dual USB-C ports that are fully functional, as well as a USB-A. It's got the largest battery, but don't let that fool you. It actually eats the most energy out of all of them. We've got a 3.5mm headphone jack, a micro SD slot, and a built-in kickstand. I actually really like the built-in kickstand, so bravo to AOKZOE on that one. So let's go ahead and pick this thing up here. You'll notice that the directional pad is a circle and not a cross. I really like the blue and yellow cyberpunk theme here. I was going to put a skin on it, but I opted not to because I like the design that much. On the right-hand side, there's a couple of option buttons here. One pulls up the on-screen keyboard, although it usually kicks you out of game when you're doing that. The other pulls up the overlay. There's a little software overlay that they write for this unit, and you can adjust things like TDP, GPU frequency, fan profile, etc. I don't know how well it works because we'll get into that a little bit later. Along the top, we've got the power button, the volume rocker, your headphone jack, a USB-C, and a USB-A. It's also where the ventilation is. And around the back, you've got this, kind of Transformers-esque cutout next to the kickstand for the fan intake. And minimal branding on the back, but the kickstand is nice. Along the bottom, we've got that micro SD card, another USB-C, and another one of those looks like a proprietary kind of stand. I couldn't find any stands on it, though. So you'll notice right off the bat, running through The Witcher here, this doesn't perform quite as smoothly as the other units. I'll get to more of that when we're talking about the conclusion at the end of this video, but this unit is by far supposed to be the fastest, and in most cases it is once you get good benches out of it, but by and large this unit has caused the most issues for us. I'm just going to run over this bridge here. I think that's plenty enough for the overview. Alright, let me go pick up the Steam Deck. Alright, I've got my Steam Deck here running Horizon Zero Dawn. What hasn't already been said about this unit? Not much. It runs an AMD APU. It's got Zen 2 cores, 4 of them, as well as 8 RDNA 2 CUs. It runs 16 gigs of LPDDR5, 5500 MHz, interesting frequency selection. Same 512 gig NVMe. 7-inch IPS LCD at 1280 by 800, so it is that lower resolution, but also 60 Hz. This also taps out at Wi-Fi 6. And it's it's in between the AOK and the other units at 11.7 by 4.6 by 1.9 inches. It's also as heavy as the AOKZOE. This one only has a single USB-C port, but it is fully functioned. It's got the smallest battery of the bunch, but don't let that fool you. A 3.5mm headphone jack, a micro SD slot, and I also called out the Steam touchpads here because they're relatively useful for some functionality. Alright, let's go ahead and pick this thing up here. Aloy looks like she's getting a little bored. All right, along the front is, a Steam Deck. Everybody's seen a bunch of videos on these. You've got your speakers, you've got your Steam button, your option button over there on the right. Along the top, you've got your volume, your 3.5mm headphone jack, your USB-C, and your power button. Let's focus around the back here. You've got a couple of trigger buttons on the back here for your index and middle fingers. Those are actually pretty useful in some games. And then along the bottom, you've got your micro SD slot. Pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and run around. Oh, it looks like I fell off a cliff here. Alrighty, so before we get into some benchmarks, let's take a quick look at how clock speed and temperatures behave for each of the Windows-based units. We pushed each one through a Cinebench R23 run and logged the data using HWInfo64 and then plotted them along the graph you're about to see. Alright, first up we've got the 1X Player Mini. The red lines on these graphs represent the temperature, and this unit targets 85 degrees for its fan profile. And you'll see to get there it kind of modulates the clock speed quite a bit. Clock speeds are jumping all around from just below 3,000 megahertz all the way up to about 4,000 megahertz. It'll be interesting to see how that reflects itself in the gaming and CPU testing. On to the Aya Neo next. Here you can actually see that the clock speed itself seems very stable. They hover right around that 3,000 to 3,100 megahertz mark, whereas the temperatures seem to be very well controlled. They ramp up to around 80 to 83 degrees, but kind of stay there as the fan modulates the airflow. All right, on to the A1. You'll see the fan takes a second to kick in here as the temperature quickly shoots up to about 83 degrees or just under. Clock speeds start out under 3,800 megahertz and quickly settle to about 35 to 36 on average. But the temps here are very well managed. You'll see them bounce around 75 degrees. The little spikes in between are actually in between Cinebench runs when it's reloading the next run, so don't pay too much mind to those. Heading over to our synthetic benchmarks, we're going to kick things off with PC Mark 10. And right away you can see the obvious advantage of those RDNA 2 cores on that 6800U. On the GPU compute side of things, the A1 was scoring just over 33,000 on average. Whereas the older Vega cores in the 5825U is in the mid-16,000s, and the Intel integrated GPU coming in last with a score of 15,765. Moving over to the single core results, the 6800U comes in first at 1480, with the 5825 putting in a good showing just below that at 1431. And the 1X Player Mini with that 1195 G7 is just a smidge under 1300. On the multi-core side, of course, the 6800U is on top at 7864. The 5825U and the Neo is at 7231. So yet another good showing. It's very close between the two generations. And the 1195 G7 just absolutely gets destroyed here, having only half the cores at 4,227. Moving on to Geekbench 5, the results get a little bit more interesting here. On the digital content creation and productivity side, the 6800U is on top. But if you notice on the essential side, the 5825 actually comes in above the 6800U as well as the 1195 G7 and that 1X Player Mini. So this is going to be a recurring theme as we get through some of these benchmarks. That 6800U is going to vary wildly all over the place with what we would normally consider results for that chip. I think it's more indicative of the unit itself than the capabilities of the chip. Next up is Blender. And we split out the three different tests that Blender runs as part of its benchmark program to kind of give you a broad swath of results here. These results are pretty much in line with what you'd expect. The 6800U is marginally ahead of the 5825U, and both are leagues ahead of the 1195 G7. And that makes quite a bit of sense given that the 1195 G7 only has 4 11th gen Intel cores. Up next, we've got Cinebench R23. On the multi-core side, things align with what you would expect. That 6800U is out ahead, scoring just over 10,480 points. The 5825U puts in a good showing at 8613, and that 1X Player Mini with the 1195 G7 is well behind at 5132. On the single-core side, things are a little interesting here. The 6800U is by a smidgen out ahead, 1502 versus 1492 on that 1195 G7, and the 5825U is actually behind at 1425. I don't know if you remember that PC Mark 10 result where the single core score on the 5825U came out a little bit ahead of the 1195 G7. So on this test, the results are actually flip-flopped on that single core. Okay, our last CPU-centric benchmark here is going to be Handbrake. As you see in a lot of the videos on this channel, we use the same file for all of the results. One thing I will note here, and this is probably why you see that 1195 G7 performing so poorly, we didn't use QuickSync. So the score that you see here is indicative of the software render using CPU cores only. So getting into the results, the 6800U surprisingly did not perform as well as the 5825U in this test. I ran the test 3 to 4 times. The result was the same every single time. So I think this is one of those results where you'll find that the 6800U is just not performing the way you would expect it to. And again, I think that's more indicative of the unit than the chip itself. So our 5825U came in first in the Neo next with a encode time of 16 minutes and 7 seconds. followed by the 6800U and that A1 at 19 minutes and 46 seconds, and that 1195 G7 all the way out there at 46 minutes and 59 seconds. I don't know how many of you would be buying these units with the intent of doing any sort of handbrake work on them, but these are the results that we got. And over in the Time Spy world, some more interesting results here. On the GPU front, the 6800U came out on top with a score of 2456, followed by the little iris graphics in the 1195 G7 at 1653, and the 5825U was trailing at 1369. On the CPU side, things stack up as you would expect them to. The 6800U is out on top, followed closely by that 5825U, and then with that a little 1195 G7 trailing well below 5,000 points. On the overall score, that 6800U in the A1 scored 2735, followed by the 1195 G7 at 1834, and then in last place is that little 5825U at 1558. One thing to note before we jump right into the actual game benchmarks is that this is just a synthetic test. And as you'll see in the coming benchmarks, synthetic doesn't always tell the full story. So let's move on to AC Valhalla. Right off the bat, I want to make a note about the performance of the A1 here. We recorded the actual footage for the sake of this four-way comparison after we'd run the benchmarks. And at that point in time, we had already started experiencing wild performance fluctuations with our A1 device. So the results you see here are not indicative of a fully functioning device. So here's where we see our Steam Deck make its first appearance. And you'll notice that while the 6800U came out on top with 55 frames a second, the Steam Deck didn't do that bad. It came in at 46. And then in third place we had that 5825U at 34 frames per second. We could not gather any data on the 1195 G7 as the game continuously crashed with driver errors and driver bugs. So it's a really good showing for the Steam Deck compared to the 6800U, especially when you consider the one is running at 15 watts and the other is running at 30. So what does that mean for percentages? Using the Steam Deck as a 0 percentage point, the 6800U and the A1 was about 20% faster on the average FPS, and the AOKZOE Next was about 26% slower. On to Cyberpunk. This game is very graphically intensive, and thank God they package a Steam Deck profile in the graphic settings for us to tune to these handhelds. Looking at the benchmark here, that 6800U is performing very well out ahead of the pack, followed by what appears to be the Steam Deck and that 1X Player Mini, and then the AOKZOE Next with those Vega cores are well behind here. So what does that translate to? Well, that translates to an average of 46 frames per second on that 6800U, followed by the Steam Deck and that 1X Player Mini being neck and neck at 35, and that 5825U at 27 frames per second. In terms of percentages, using the Steam Deck as the 0% baseline, the A1 came out about 31% faster. The 1X Player Mini was 3%, which is within the margin of error, so effectively the same. The AOKZOE Next, it was about 23% slower with those Vega cores. As for GTA 5, a bit of an older title, but as you can see, all four units have zero problems running this on the normal preset at a 720p resolution. That 6800U in the A1 is well out ahead of the pack. It looks like the 1X Player Mini and the AOKZOE Next are performing pretty much in line with each other, and the Steam Deck actually coming in last place here, just judging based off of looking at the FPS while we run through the benchmark. In terms of results, the A1 was well out ahead with 125 FPS, followed by that 1X Player Mini at 102, and the Steam Deck was actually slightly behind at 98, with the AOKZOE Next coming in last at 90. To put that into perspective, the A1 was about 28% faster than the Steam Deck. The 1X Player Mini was 4% faster, again, just teetering on that margin of error line. And the AOKZOE Next was 8% slower. Hitman 3 is a bit of a newer title that actually uses quite a bit of CPU in its gameplay. And already here we could see that the A1 is well positioned to tackle the benchmark. I see it teetering around 60 frames per second, while the One X Player Mini and that Aya Neo Next are hovering around 40 to low 40s. And the Steam Deck is coming in well under 30, which is, on the borderline of being unplayable. But we're going to let this benchmark run a little bit further, and then we'll dive right into the results. And as for results, wow, the A1 came out well ahead of the pack with 67 frames per second, followed by the One X Player Mini pulling in a good showing at 46 frames per second, and that Aya Neo Next at 43 frames per second. Well, we didn't log the results for Hitman 3 as, when we dug around the file system, we could not find where the benchmark was storing the output. So we marked this as did not run. But if you want to see how it performs relative to the other units, we recommend going back and taking a look at the benchmark video prior to this slide. So what does that mean for percentages? Since we didn't have Steam Deck results, we changed the baseline to that Aya Neo Next. And the A1 was 56% faster than the Aya Neo. And that One X Player Mini was about 7% faster than the Aya Neo. So on to Horizon Zero Dawn, and right away you can see that A1 well ahead of the pack here. And surprisingly, the Steam Deck is putting in a good showing. It really highlights the optimization of the Steam OS and Proton to be able to run this benchmark around low to mid 50s, where the One X and Aya Neo are neck and neck at about 40 to 43 frames per second. But let's take a look at the chart and see how the results came out. All right, well, this looks pretty much like what we were just witnessing. The A1 averaged 74 frames per second across our multiple runs, followed by that Steam Deck at 51 frames per second, which is an excellent showing for the Steam Deck, followed by the 5825U in that Aya Neo with 43 frames per second, and just behind that is the One X Player Mini with 41 frames per second. So what does that translate to in terms of percentages? Using Steam Deck as a baseline, the A1 is 45% faster. The Aya Neo Next was 16% slower, and the One X Player Mini was 20% slower. Taking a look at Red Dead Redemption 2, unfortunately our A1 was down for the count. We had some quality issues with the device, and it stopped charging and stopped working and performing the way that we wanted it to, so we don't have any video footage of how the A1 was doing during benchmarking here. We do have benchmark results, but we just couldn't capture any benchmark footage. Okay, so for results, the A1 did come out ahead with 50. So for the results, the A1 did come out ahead with 56 frames per second while it was still running. The Steam Deck was in a close second at 49 frames per second. The Aya Neo Next was at 43 frames per second, and we could not get a stable run on that One X Player Mini, so we were unable to gather any average frames per second data for the benchmark here. Alright, so what does that mean for percentages? Using Steam Deck as the baseline, that 6800U in the A1 was 14% faster, so a good showing for the Steam Deck here. And the Aya Neo Next was about 13% slower. Taking a look at Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we actually used a scene in the benchmark that uses a blend of graphics and CPU to kind of pull some of these apart. The A1 is out ahead of the pack. It looks like it's hovering in the mid-50s. And that's actually followed by the Steam Deck, which is, surprising. It's in the low to mid-40s. And then again, the Aya Neo and that One X Player Mini are neck and neck in the just below 40 range. Okay, so for the results, that A1 actually averaged 61 frames per second across the entire benchmark, followed by the Steam Deck at 47 frames per second. Followed by the Aya Neo Next at 38 frames per second, and then in last place was that One X Player Mini at 32 frames per second. What that translates to is the A1 being about 30% faster than the Steam Deck, the Aya Neo being about 19% slower, and that One X Player Mini being about 32% slower. We're going to round off our gaming benchmarks with The Witcher 3. This is the newer complete edition in DirectX 12. And as you can see here, the A1 was already tapped out of the race here. But we did manage to capture some footage on the other three. And you could see the Intel chip here trailing quite a bit to the other two. But let's take a look at the results. Okay, so the Steam Deck we marked as did not record. I didn't have any way to capture the actual frames per second for the Steam Deck in this particular test, but you can go ahead and rewind to see how it was performing in a like-for-like sort of jaunt through Toussaint. But getting on to the results, the A1 here was out ahead of the pack at 48 frames per second when it was running, followed by the Aya Neo close behind at 45 frames per second. A really good showing for the Aya Neo here. I don't know if there's something going on with the drivers or if this is the start of the performance issues we had with that AOKZOE A1. And that poor little 1X Player Mini was well behind at a barely playable 31 frames per second. So if we use that 1X Player Mini as the baseline, the Aya Neo was about 45% faster and the A1 was about 55% faster. Alright, so on to fan noise while gaming. The 1X Player and the Aya Neo are both the loudest, followed by the A1, which is slightly quieter, and the Steam Deck pulling 8 to 10 decibels less than the other three. But let's go ahead and take a listen to see what it sounds like. Alright, now let's see if that fan profile changes with a CPU load. Alright, so with Cinebench running as a CPU-only load on these devices, you can see that the A1 and the Aya Neo Next have now ramped up their fan profiles and they've gotten significantly louder. Let's go ahead and take a listen. Alright, so the only thing left now is final words and conclusions. So what do we think? Let's start with the 1X Player Mini. It's the most portable and smallest of the bunch, which is nice. It had additional ports, which is very useful, especially with these units. All of them had issues with various docks and port replicators and, you name it, adapters. So having the extra on-device ports really helped out quite a bit. It had decent battery life. It's better than the Aya Neo and the A1, but not quite as good as the Steam Deck. And there were no real hardware issues with the unit, which is something that's going to come into play for the other devices. In terms of the cons, it had the weakest performance of the bunch. Granted, it's the most outdated and oldest CPU. It had the dimmest screen, as you can see on display here. Intel GPU drivers are historically awful for gaming. And the price is way too much for the performance that you're getting. So unless you really need to use QuickSync or something like that that's Intel-based, I wouldn't recommend. So how did the Aya Neo do? Well, as you can see here, it's got that nice bright screen. The additional fully functional USB-C port helps when you're trying to connect various things to the unit. AMD GPU drivers, which are much more stable than the Intel side. The unit also has an FSR scaler built in, which is part of that little software that they put on that big button there. And supposedly it uses Hall joysticks. I am not a connoisseur of joysticks, so I cannot tell you whether or not they are indeed Hall or not, but they feel really nice. Now, in terms of cons, it's only slightly faster than the 1X Player Mini. That Vega integrated GPU chip is showing its age by now. It's got an odd start and select button placement. I can't tell you how many times I pushed the wrong one trying to find the other. The custom software is not as polished as some of the competitors. It is too pricey. Towards the end, it developed a random popping noise, and it's very finicky with charger selection. The A1. I'm going to go through the pros quickly here because even though the cons list is short, they are significant. It's got a big and bright screen, which is nice. It's got those additional ports. I only list the USB-C port because the A port stopped working. It's got AMD GPU drivers, which are much more stable. It's got the best performance when it's running. Love the kickstand, and it's slightly quieter than the other two units outside the Steam Deck. Now, cons, this unit had lots of quality control issues. I cannot stress that enough. And to combat that and make it worse, there was non-existent support post-sales. I tried reaching out 5 to 6 times to Discord, to emails. Nobody responded. Nobody cared. It had the shortest battery life of the bunch, to the point where the battery actually stopped charging after a while. It's way too pricey for the quality, and it's very heavy and large. I cannot recommend buying this unit at all. Please avoid. The beloved Steam Deck, and the winner of our comparison here. All right, let's get right into the pros. The ergonomics on this thing are excellent. It is the most comfortable to hold out of all of the units we tested. The software is optimized. You get much more performance than you would expect given the technology and the chip used. It's half the price. Right, this thing was $500 compared to $900 to $1,200 depending upon when you buy the other ones. It's got an FSR scaler built right into SteamOS, works with every single game. It's quiet, running 8 to 10 decibels less than the other units we tested. You've got full Steam integration with an excellent UI to use handheld, and there were no issues in our testing with quality control. On the cons, it's a little bit on the larger side. You might find compatibility lacking compared to a full Windows OS. The screen is not the most detailed or the most vibrant, and it is the handheld we would select out of the units we tested here. So there you have it. We had a lot of fun and some frustration testing these units for you. I'm a newcomer to the channel, but I plan to stick around for some time, if only to keep Steven company. Be sure to like and subscribe as we have quite a bit of content coming up for all the new laptop releases just around the corner. Thanks for watching. Cheers, everyone.